A warm welcome to everyone to the anesthesia classes. The topic for today is monitoring in anesthesia. See, monitoring in anesthesia forms a very vital part of anesthesia practice, not only to reduce the mortality and morbidity in patients, but also to reduce the provider's liability. Monitoring in anesthesia is a very wide concept in anesthesia. So, in the very first part of monitoring, we will be dealing with only one, that is the oxygenation part. The today's presentation is divided into two parts. One would be the systemic oxygenation, which I would tell you very briefly about the important points that you all must know, and second would be one of the equipments to monitor that oxygen levels, which is the pulse oximeter, which is one of the mandatory monitors or one of the mandatory ASA monitors, that is the American Society of Anesthesiologists monitor in the practice. So coming, the first thing that you all have to know, what are the standards monitors which are required in the anesthesia practice. See, when we talk about monitoring, the monitoring could be of two types. One could be the physiological monitoring and other could be the behavior monitoring. In the physiological monitoring comes all your vitals, whereas the behavior monitoring consists of your awareness during anesthesia. So, the standards of monitoring state that the very first prerequisite is a qualified anesthesia personnel has to be present throughout the conduct of anesthesia to use his acumen to deal with the ever-changing condition of an anesthetized patient. I repeat, the very first requirement for the monitoring is a qualified anesthesia personnel. Coming over to the next is you have to monitor the oxygen. For that, it is mandatory that the oxygen concentration in the inspired gas as well as the blood levels of the oxygen has to be calculated, which could be done with the help of first oxygen analyzers, which can tell you about the oxygen concentration in the inspired gas, and they do have an alarm that, for example, the minimal oxygen which is required when the patient is undergoing controlled ventilation is 33%. So if the oxygen concentration decreases by 33%, within 5 seconds a audible alarm sets in, which can never be muted. So oxygen analyzers are used to check the oxygen concentration where? In the inspired gas. Second is the pulse oximeter, which tells you about the saturation of the arterial blood, that is the blood saturation inside the patient. So the second mandatory monitor to be present is pulse oximeter, and this pulse oximeter is such that it has a variability in the pitch of the pulse tone, which changes with the changing saturation, so that even if the anesthesia provider is not looking at the monitor, the tone, the pitch of the pulse tone would tell how is the saturation going on. And lastly, obviously, you should have adequate light in order to assess cyanosis. The third and most important mandatory monitoring is the monitoring of ventilation of the patient. For the ventilation part, we have qualitative signs and quantitative signs. So quantitative mandatory monitor is end-tidal CO2. I repeat, it is ETCO2. So three monitors mandatory are: one, personnel; second, oxygen analyzers and pulse oximeter; and third is ETCO2. In qualitative signs, you can always check the chest movements, your reservoir bag, or you can auscultate the breath sounds. And when it comes to be a quantitative or a numerical value which can tell you about the adequacy of the ventilation, you have your ETCO2, and some places where higher end of machines are present, we can have volume of expired gases also, which could tell us about the adequacy of the ventilation. Then we have circulation. So the mandatory monitors to see the circulation are ECG and non-invasive blood pressure. And all these are all optional, that is intra-arterial blood pressure, palpation of pulse you can do, you can't, auscultating the heart sounds. Generally, this auscultation of heart sound, please remember if it is a pediatric case which is written, so precordial stethoscope is a mandatory monitor for a pediatric case. Lastly, we have body temperature. Body temperature helps us to maintain the appropriate body temperature because, interestingly, under general anesthesia, every 30 minutes, at least 1 degree Celsius, 0.5 to 1 degree Celsius drop in body temperature has been noted. So we have 5 mandatory monitors. One is a qualified anesthesia personnel. Second is to monitor the oxygenation with the help of pulse oximeter. Third, to monitor ventilation, that is with the help of EtCO2. Then hemodynamics have to be monitored using ECG and blood pressure. And lastly, your body temperature. Moving forwards, so this is in brief or a summary of all the monitors that are present in anesthesia. We can have respiratory monitors, cardiovascular monitoring. And if you remember, I had talked about the behavior monitoring, that is to check the awareness of the patient under anesthesia. Because believe it or not, if the patient is aware during anesthesia, it's a medico-legal issue. So we have neurological monitorings also, which will include your BIS, that is bispectral index, your entropy, intracranial pressure monitoring, and neuromuscular monitoring. We'll be coming to each and every monitoring in brief, but in the upcoming presentations. And lastly, we have metabolic monitorings, which is a part of the physiological monitoring, which will include the temperature and the ABG. Now, moving forwards to the first and the foremost monitor that we have to discuss is the oxygenation part. So first, I'll be telling you briefly a little bit about the systemic oxygenation to just give you an idea about how important the oxygen is in our body and how actually the oxygen is being transported in the blood from the atmosphere to our tissues. And next, we'll move forward to the pulse oximeter, which is the equipment which is used to measure the oxygenation. So coming to the life. Yeah, oxygen is the life. It was first synthesized by Priestley. Must know. The name oxygen was given by Lavoisier. Must know again. Medical oxygen is prepared by fractional distillation of air. This is the oxygen cylinder. The color is must know. That is a black body, BB, and white shoulders. The pressure of oxygen in the cylinders is 2000 pounds per square inch. It is colorless, odorless, but flammable. And the critical temperature of oxygen is minus 119 degree Celsius. This is the temperature above which no matter how much pressure you apply, you can never convert the gaseous form into a liquid form. And this is the reason why oxygen is always a gas, because the critical temperature of oxygen is 119 degree Celsius. I repeat, it was synthesized by Priestley, coined by Lavoisier. It is a black body, white shoulder cylinder with 2000 psi pressure, and the critical temperature of it is minus 119 degree Celsius. Now moving forward to one of the laws of pressure, which is very important when we talk about atmospheric oxygen, that is that the total pressure which is exerted in a container when the volume and temperature are constant is equal to the pressure of the individual gases that are present. This is the Dalton's law of pressure, which states that when the volume and the temperature are constant, in a closed container, the total pressure that is being exerted on the walls is equal to the individual pressure of all the gases which are present in the container. Next, how oxygen is actually carried in our blood. See, oxygen is actually carried in two forms. One, dissolved in plasma, and second, bound to hemoglobin. See, only 3% of oxygen is carried as dissolved form. Rest, all the oxygen is carried in the form bound to hemoglobin. And this is the type of oxygen that is measured using pulse oximeter. So the total oxygen content of our blood is 1.34 multiplied by the hemoglobin that you have into the saturation that the patient has plus the dissolved form of the oxygen, which is dependent on the partial pressure of the oxygen in the blood. Please remember that the partial pressure of oxygen is what on which this dissolved form of oxygen depends upon. Okay. One more thing that is worth remembering here is that 1 gram of hemoglobin carries 1.34 ml of oxygen. Please remember this line. 1 gram of hemoglobin carries 1.34 ml of oxygen. Thus, when we use these calculations using these numerical values, we are not going to go under the calculation part. The two numericals which you all have to know are the total arterial content of oxygen, which is 20 milliliters per deciliter, and total venous blood content of oxygen, that is 15 ml per deciliter. Rest has been used by the tissues, right? So in this very slide, there are a lot of numbers which you have to remember. The first is 3% only dissolved form of oxygen is there. Maximum oxygen is bound to hemoglobin. This equation is the total oxygen content in our body. 1 gram of hemoglobin will carry 1.34 ml of oxygen, and the dissolved oxygen is directly proportional to the partial pressure of the oxygen in our blood. Lastly, the total arterial content of oxygen is 20 ml per deciliter and venous content is 15 ml per deciliter. Rest, the difference has been utilized by our tissues. Then coming forward to yet one very important topic, that is oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. First thing to remember is, what is this curve about? This curve is, on the x-axis we have the partial pressure of oxygen versus the saturation of the oxygen on the y-axis. It's a relation of partial pressure in millimeters of mercury versus the oxygen saturation of hemoglobin. The salient features of this curve are, as you can see it, it's sigmoidal in shape. It has a high peak and then a flat portion. Now this high peak which comes is because of the concept of positive cooperativity. See, positive cooperation means that our hemoglobin has 4 iron moieties. I hope you all are aware of it. And our oxygen is going to join this iron. And when one oxygen joins the iron, it increases the affinity of all the rest of the iron molecules to join the oxygen. This is known as the positive cooperation, because of which the sigmoid curve comes. The first thing. Second thing that you can look at this curve and tell, this flat portion of this curve, This is the arterial part of the curve, or the loading part of the curve. And where does the loading of the oxygen occurs? In the lungs. So this part represents the lung or the loading part, the arterial part, where you can easily see that if we are talking about 100 millimeters of oxygen, the saturation at this level is almost around 97 or 98. And this very part, the steep part, is what is happening in tissues at tissue level, which is the unloading part or the venous part. And here the unloading of the oxygen occurs, and this is the steep portion. One of the important or advantageous part of the sigmoid curve is, if you look at the sigmoid curve very carefully, just see, suppose the partial pressure of the oxygen has fallen from 100 to say 60. Done. From 100 to 60 it has fallen. But just look at the fall in the saturation. If at 100 we take the saturation like 100 or 98%, at 60 also the saturation is about 90%. So the partial pressure of the oxygen has fallen by 40 mmHg, but still the saturation has fallen only by 10%. So this is because of this sigmoidal curve, that we have that compensatory mechanisms, or we have that homeostasis in our body, that we can maintain the saturation of our blood even if the partial pressure of the oxygen has decreased. But the limit is there. Then the limit is around 50 millimeters of mercury. And below PaO2 of 50 millimeters of mercury, cyanosis ensues in the body. So you see that after the partial pressure of oxygen has reached 50 millimeters of mercury, we have a steep fall of the saturation of the hemoglobin. And one more number that you have to remember is the P50. It's must to know. The P50, please remember, P50 is the partial pressure of the oxygen at which the hemoglobin is 50% saturated and not vice versa. I repeat, P50 is the partial pressure of the oxygen in the blood at which the oxygen or the hemoglobin is 50% saturated, and the value of P50 is 26 millimeters of mercury. Value of P50 is 26 millimeters of mercury, and this value is not affected by our anesthetist. I'm sorry, this value is not affected by the anesthetic drugs. The last concept in the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve comes about the rightward and the leftward shift of the curve. Anything which means that the oxygen has to leave the hemoglobin will make the curve shift to right, and anything that will make the oxygen more firmly bind to the hemoglobin will lead to a leftward shift of the curve. Like for right shift, we have a mnemonic of cadet. Anything that is increasing the oxygen demand will lead to a rightward shift. For example, carbon dioxide. If there is increase in the carbon dioxide at the tissue level, we need more oxygen to compensate for the same. Increase in H positive ions, increase in 2,3-DPG. Okay, when we talk about 2,3-DPG, it's a part of Meinhof pathway, and it has a very high affinity for hemoglobin. So what it does, if the value of 2,3-DPG increases, or there is a condition known as pyruvate kinase deficiency, so this value increases. So this joins to hemoglobin and oxygen gets dissociated or released from it. Increase in temperature, of course the demand increases, and exercise, the demand increases. And just the vice versa of this comes to the left shift. If the temperature decrease, 2,3-DPG decrease, H positive decrease, and lastly we have carbon monoxide. If there is carbon monoxide, even that decreases the release of the oxygen from the hemoglobin. And one star thing that you all have to know is about fetal hemoglobin. Even fetal hemoglobin will lead to a leftward shift of the curve. Okay, this is important to do. Carbon monoxide and fetal hemoglobin both lead to leftward shift of the curve. And lastly, coming to the concept of the Bohr and the Haldane effect. See, the Bohr effect happens at the tissue level, that is BT, and the Haldane effect, that is Halley, occurs at the level of lungs. Haldane occurs at the level of lungs. Now, what happens at the tissue levels? The tissue levels, what happens is that we have carbon dioxide increased at the tissue. We have increase in H positive. So, the oxygen affinity for the hemoglobin decreases and we have release of oxygen. That is Bohr effect. And the opposite happens in the lungs, which is the Haldane effect. We have carbon dioxide and H positive, which are expired, and the hemoglobin now joins oxygen to it. That is, there is loading of the oxygen onto the hemoglobin. This is the Haldane effect. I repeat, Bohr effect occurs at the level of tissues, whereas there is release of the oxygen because of increase in CO2 and H positive. When they increase, we need more oxygen. And what happens in lungs? Because of that concentration gradient which was created, oxygen comes, loads on hemoglobin, and carbon dioxide and H positive move to the alveoli to be expired in the gases. Now coming to 4 definitions that you all must remember. First, oxygen delivery. Very easy to understand. What is oxygen delivery? It's the rate of transport of oxygen in the arterial blood. That what is the ml of oxygen will be transported in the arterial blood per minute. That is oxygen delivery. Of course, oxygen delivery will depend upon your cardiac output. Second is the oxygen uptake. Again, as the name suggests, uptake means how much the oxygen will move out of the capillaries into the tissues, right? This is one of the most vital and important parameters. The value of oxygen uptake has to be remembered, that is 200 to 270 ml per minute, and the option if given will be 250 ml per minute is the oxygen uptake by the tissues. Okay, this is very important for us because the oxygen uptake will eventually decide about the safe apnea period that the patient can have, especially during general anesthesia or during cardiac arrest. That how much time or how much consumption of oxygen that is present in our blood will be used by the tissues, which is vital and we can sustain our tissues before hypoxia ensues. That is the oxygen uptake, which is 250 ml per minute. Then oxygen extraction, how much the tissues are taking out of how much is being delivered to them. Then oxygen flux, this is amount of oxygen which is leaving your left ventricle per minute. That is the oxygen flux. Out of these 4, I again repeat, the most important is your oxygen uptake, that is rate of oxygen that moves out of the capillaries into the tissues, which is 250 ml per minute, which is important to decide about the safe apnea period that the patient can sustain, especially during general anesthesia or maybe during the cardiac arrest time. Then coming over to one more important stuff, that is the anaerobic threshold. See, as the word suggests, anaerobic threshold will mean, suppose the oxygen consumption of a tissue is very high, right? So we have a lot of ATPs that have to be produced. We have a very high demand of energy and we need a lot of ATPs. So after aerobic metabolism saturates, then anaerobic metabolism comes into place. And because of this anaerobic metabolism, what we produce is lactic acid, and finally leading to metabolic acidosis. So anaerobic threshold is the oxygen consumption by the tissues above which aerobic energy production has to be supplemented by anaerobic metabolism, because aerobic energy production is not able to sustain the high amount of energy that is being used. For example, this could be a case like sepsis. And the value of anaerobic threshold is that the oxygen consumption minimum above which aerobic energy production will not help us uh, like independently will be 9 to 11 ml per kg per minute. And the last concept of all that we'll be dealing in systemic oxygenation is the oxygen cascade. See, when we are talking about oxygen cascade, it is a stepwise approach of the transport of the oxygen from the atmosphere till the tissues. This is the oxygen cascade, that is, we start from the atmosphere and eventually ending till the mitochondria level, that is your tissue level. Now coming forwards to one step of oxygen cascade, we have the process of declining oxygen tension from atmosphere to mitochondria. And now I'll be telling in brief that how this at each step, why do we have a decrease in the oxygen content. The very first, this is the starting point of the oxygen cascade, 160 millimeters of mercury. As I've already told you, the Dalton's law. What did Dalton's law state? Of course, this is not a ideal condition for Dalton's law to be applied, but still, when we talk about our atmosphere, it is air and the air have a lot of gases in it, and the partial pressure of the air will be equal to the sum of the partial pressures of all the gases which are present or which make up the air actually. So the atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury and 21% we have is oxygen, right? Which comes out to be 160 millimeters of mercury. That is the atmospheric oxygen pressure. This is the oxygen pressure that we inspire. That is the 160 millimeters of mercury. First thing done. Now what happens is, as we have taken up the oxygen, what happens is it has to pass through a nose and a mouth. And you all know that there is some moisture, humidification, some cilia and certain buffers which are present in our respiratory or the conducting zone of a respiratory tract. And by the dilution of these water vapors, the oxygen content further decreases from 160 to 150 millimeters of mercury because of the presence of moisture or the water vapors in our conducting zone. Now finally, this humidified oxygen comes to our alveoli. In the alveoli, we have only 100 millimeters of mercury. Now where did this 50 millimeters of mercury go? So the partial pressure of alveoli is equal to partial pressure of inspired oxygen minus the partial pressure of carbon dioxide upon the respiratory coefficient. That is, when the alveoli, it is mixed with the CO2 and CO2 gets added up and it further dilutes your oxygen, and thus eventually what oxygen is present for the actual transport or the actual diffusion is only 100 millimeters of mercury, because carbon dioxide has now been added to this oxygen, and thus This equation, that is the alveolar gas equation, is very important to note, and please do remember this equation. This is capital A. Please be very careful when you are dealing with the MCQs which state that which of the following is alveolar gas equation. It has to be a capital A and not a small a. The capital A, PaO2, is equal to the inspired oxygen minus the CO2 partial pressure over the respiratory coefficient. Now moving forward, when we talk about the pulmonary circulation, now the oxygen which is present in the pulmonary circulation is further decreased. Now why does this decrease occurs now? Eventually, the oxygen in the blood is only 95 millimeters of mercury because of physiological shunt. What does physiological shunt means? That is, there is a ventilation perfusion mismatch that occurs in the alveoli because of the presence of bronchial vessels which don't get oxygenated. That is, they pass through such parts of the lung which are either atelectatic, and this is all physiological. These presence of these bronchial vessels which carry deoxygenated blood in this. This could be one reason why the eventually jo oxygen content of the arterial blood is lesser than what is present in the alveoli, which could be because of the presence of these bronchial vessels which have deoxygenated blood in them. And second could be some part of the lungs are atelectatic, because of which there is no exchange of the gases in those parts. And these are all physiological shunting and thus lead to decrease, a minimal decrease of oxygen in the arterial blood. Now, eventually at the arterial level, we have our oxygen to be around 95 millimeters of mercury. And this is the oxygen that is carried to our tissues, and the tissues will extract whatever amount of oxygen they need. And finally, we have a venous oxygen that is only 45 millimeters of mercury that is left, and rest all the oxygen has been used by the tissues. And eventually at the level of mitochondria, when we talk, we have only 5 to 7 millimeters of mercury of oxygen that is left. And this is the end point of oxygen cascade. I hope the things are clear to you all. Oxygen cascade is nothing but the declining of the oxygen tension from the atmosphere to the mitochondria. In the atmosphere, we start with 160 millimeters of mercury, then the oxygen gets humidified, it decreases, then further in alveoli, CO2 gets mixed, it further decreases, and eventually in the arterial blood, we have some physiological shunts like bronchial vessels or ventilation perfusion mismatching, and in arterial blood, the eventual oxygen that is reaching the tissues is decreased to 100 millimeters of mercury, and this oxygen is then used by the tissues, and we have the leftover oxygen which is carried by the venous blood, which is 45 millimeters of mercury. And eventually when we talk about the tissues, in the tissues, the mitochondria, which are the energy stores, they have the oxygen content of 5 millimeters of mercury that is left, and eventually the electron transport chain occurs and ATPs are produced. Now, one thing important here was one of the equations that I just want you all to revise, which I am very sure you must have revised in your physiology also, is the diffusion of gas equation. When I was talking about that the gases are being diffused, or they have to go from alveoli to the blood vessels, they all have to cross something which is known as the membranes or a barrier. This barrier consists of certain layers which you all have to remember very nicely, that which are the layers that the oxygen has to cross to diffuse into the capillaries. Here, three things are worth remembering. One, it is diffusion that takes place. Second, This diffusion is checked by using carbon monoxide. And third, this diffusion depends upon the Fick's law. Okay, the three things worth remembering in this is diffusion through a membrane. It is checked by using carbon monoxide, and it is dependent upon the Fick's law of diffusion. Now, what is this Fick's law of diffusion, which states that the diffusion of oxygen depends upon first a coefficient, then the partial pressure gradient between the alveoli and the capillaries, the surface area, how much it is present. More the surface area, more the diffusion, and inversely proportional to the thickness. More the thickness, less the diffusion. So any condition, like for example, you can have pulmonary edema or you can have fibrosis, which increases the thickness of this membrane, will lead to decrease in diffusion, and anything that is going to increase the surface area will increase the diffusion. And when it calls for decrease in the surface area, like very important surfactant, if you have a problem with the surfactant, again the diffusion capacity of the lungs will eventually decrease. So the layers which we have to cross, that the oxygen has to cross from the alveoli to the capillaries are, the first layer is that of the surfactant, then the alveolar epithelium, then the basement membrane, and eventually the basement membrane of the capillary, and finally the blood vessel. Okay. When we are talking about certain conditions which can lead to change in the diffusion, there are many conditions which can do so, but there are three drugs: bleomycin, methotrexate, and amiodarone, which are actually asked a lot many times, that which are the drugs which can lead to decrease in the diffusion capacity of the lungs by hampering this basement membrane. And these are three drugs which you all have to remember: one, bleomycin, methotrexate, and eventually amiodarone. Now coming to the last part and the last slide of the systemic oxygenation, these are the clinical markers of impaired tissue oxygenation, which comes like one of the following is the clinical marker, or out of which is not the clinical marker. So you have to remember that the first clinical marker which shows us whether the oxygen which is being used by the tissue or the tissue hypoxia is there or not is the oxygen uptake. I already told you oxygen uptake optimal is 250 ml per minute, but if it is less than 100 ml per minute, it means something bad is happening. Second, if the difference of the oxygen of arterial blood and the venous blood is more than 50%, even then it is bad, because again it is showing that the oxygen consumption is very high, and thus eventually aerobic metabolism will saturate and anaerobic metabolism is going to start in the body. Similarly, if the venous oxygen concentration or the saturation is less than 50%, generally the venous blood has a saturation of 75%. If it is less than 50%, again it should ring your bells. And lastly, and the most importantly, is the serum lactate. I've already told you the story and how lactate is being produced. So if the serum lactate levels are more than 4 millimole per liter, it is highly significant and something has to be done before the morbidity or the mortality of the patient increases. I repeat, when we are talking about the impaired tissue oxygenation, we are talking about the oxygen uptake which less than 100, or the difference of the oxygen content of your arterial and the venous blood is more than 50%, your venous oxygen saturation is less than 50%, or the serum lactate, which is a very good prognostic marker, has to be more than 4 millimole per liter. which is highly significant of the impaired tissue oxygenation. Now, coming to how this oxygenation of the blood is actually measured, we have a non-invasive, a continuous marker or a continuous monitor which is known by the name of pulse oximeter, which is a surrogate marker for tissue perfusion also. Okay. SpO2 is the fifth vital sign, and the normal levels of SpO2 are 95 to 99%. That is the saturation of the arterial blood. What all parameters can your pulse oximeter measure? Our pulse oximeter can give us SpO2, it can give us the pulse rate, and it can give us a plethysmographic wave, and lastly it can give us a perfusion index, which actually tells us about the tissue perfusion also. Okay, it is telling us about the SpO2, pulse rate, plethysmographic wave, and eventually perfusion index. What it is estimating? It is estimating the bound form of oxygen to the hemoglobin. That is the peripheral arterial oxygen saturation of hemoglobin. Now, when we are talking about pulse oximeter, it is very important to understand the various analysis or the laws which are associated with it, because all this form a part of your MCQs. The first is the photoplethysmographic analysis. The first thing that your pulse oximeter does is it differentiates. See, when you have applied your pulse oximeter on your fingers, now it has to differentiate between two things. You have your pulsatile arterial blood, and second thing that you have is your non-pulsatile signals, which come from your venous blood or your tissues. So that analysis is known by the name of photoplethysmographic analysis. So all the pulsatile arterial signals are analyzed or transmitted. Rest all the non-pulsatile signals are reflected back. And thus we have the plethysmographic waveform in which these peaks, can you see these peaks? All these peaks correspond to your systolic phase or your pulsatile phase, whereas these troughs or this part is your non-pulsatile part, or in the other sense we can also say alternating current and direct current part, the steady part and the pulsatile part. So this is one of the major functions of your plethysmography, that is your pulse oximeter is able to differentiate the pulsatile arterial signals from the non-pulsatile arterial signals. This I have already discussed, that the uses of pulse oximeter are tissue perfusion, and one of the uses are in the orthopedic surgeries. They actually use it to locate the arteries and to see whether the if the arterial damage is there or there is viability of the arteries to a limb. Then perfusion index. Perfusion index is going to tell us about the tissue perfusion, and the normal value of the perfusion index is 0.2 to 20%. See, when we are talking about the perfusion index, still no question has been asked on perfusion index, but this is a potential future questions, because nowadays a lot of studies, a lot of trials, and a lot of equipments are coming with the perfusion index incorporated into it. And lastly, we can use the pulse oximeter during your surgeries, during your transport, and during your ICU stay also. Coming over to the second important part of pulse oximeter, which is the spectrophotometry. See, what does a pulse oximeter actually does? See, pulse oximeter has two photodiodes and one detector or a sensor. What happens is there are two photodiodes. One is giving infrared light of 940 nanometers and the other is giving red light of 660 nanometers. Right? There are two lights which are given. Now these lights cross our finger. In the finger, we have two different types of hemoglobins. One is oxygenated, one is deoxygenated. And both these forms of hemoglobin have a different absorbance. That the oxygenated hemoglobin is going to absorb the infrared rays. This is something that you all have to remember, that oxygenated hemoglobin is going to absorb the infrared rays, whereas the deoxygenated hemoglobin is going to absorb your red light. And eventually the lights which are not absorbed, they are transmitted to the sensor. And then the sensor is going to calculate and analyze the ratio, that how much red light has reached it, how much infrared light has reached it, and is eventually calculates the percentage of the oxyhemoglobin that is present in the blood. Okay. So this is the absorbance ratio which our pulse oximeter finally generates in the form of SpO2. That is how much oxygenated hemoglobin is present out of the total hemoglobin of oxygenated plus deoxygenated. This is known as the functional oxygen saturation, because this is the form of hemoglobin which is functional actually. So I repeat that there are two lights, infrared, red light, which are generated by the photodiodes, and eventually we have two types of substances, deoxygenated and oxygenated. Infrared is taken up by oxygenated and the reduced form of hemoglobin absorbs your red light, and rest, the light that is left, is transmitted to the sensor, and sensor is now going to sense the absorbance ratio, and eventually we have the functional oxygen saturation that comes on our monitors. Now again, in this spectrophotometry, there is one potential question for the future, which is the isos-Bectic points. Yeah, this one. I'll write it down here. Isos. Yeah, a bit tricky spellings. Isos-Bectic points. These are the points or the wavelength at which the absorbance of both oxy and deoxyhemoglobin are the same. Okay, I'll repeat. These are the two wavelengths. One is 590 nanometers, other is 808 nanometers. These are the 2 points where the absorbance capacity of both the type of hemoglobin are the same. See this one and this. They both clash at these 2 points, and these points are known as isos-Bectic points. Now, what is the principle on which this pulse oximeter was actually dependent on? This is the Lambert-Beer law. Till now, what I have told you, first, the pulse oximeter is going to differentiate between the pulsatile and the non-pulsatile. That is, the photoplethysmographic analysis would be there, right? Secondly, it is going for spectrophotometry. It is going to tell us what is the functional hemoglobin saturation using the spectrophotometry. And lastly, we have to talk about on what factors does this pulse oximeter actually work. This works on Lambert-Beer law. What does Lambert-Beer law says? That the absorbance of any wavelength depends upon two things. One, that is the Baer law. The absorbance is directly proportional to the amount of solute present in the solvent. If there is more solute, then more light will be absorbed. If there is less solute, so less light will be absorbed. And secondly, L for L, absorbance is directly proportional to the distance or the length that is covered by the wavelength. More the length, more is the absorbance. Lambert-Beer law is like a 5-star rating wala question. So the Baer law is concentration, more solute, more absorbance. Lambert is L for length, more length to be transversed, more will be the absorbance. Now moving forward, where all areas of the body can you actually place your probe? See, the most commonly used area are your terminal phalanges, okay? And secondly, we can use your toes, your ear lobes. And when we are talking about the core organ, now this is important, the core organ that can be used to measure the SpO2 is your esophagus. Okay, we have probes that go into the esophagus to measure your SpO2. And if we have to measure the SpO2 in amputated patients, then what can we do? We can use our forehead. See, one thing which is not very important for you all to know is that pulse oximetry can be of two types. One, we have transmitted manner. Second is reflective. That is, the photodiode and the sensor are present on the same side. That is the reflectance pulse oximeter. But the importance is that in amputated patients, we use the reflectance pulse oximeter, and the area where we use it is the forehead. So when we talk about the probe placements, three things or three areas are very important. Terminal phalanges, your esophagus, the core organ which can be used. And third, in amputated patients, you can use reflectance pulse oximeter which can be applied on your forehead. Advantages, it is quite accurate, independent, it is very fast, it's convenient, it has that pulse width or the pitch tone which changes with the pulse oximeter, and it's quite economical and compact too. Now, pulse oximeter has its own limitations which you all have to remember. First, it cannot tell you anything about the metabolism of oxygen or the ventilation part. Second, it is not a reliable source to judge about the oxygen toxicity. Third, it has a lag time of at least 5 minutes. Lag time means that your partial pressure of oxygen is decreasing and still your saturation is coming. Yes, the saturation is coming correct. There is a lag time. And lastly, it has erratic performances when the pulse rate is irregular or you have dysarrhythmias, then the pulse oximeter is not a very reliable source to measure the oxygenation. Last, what are the factors which are going to affect the pulse oximeter? The very first and the most important to know are the dyshemoglobinemias, that is the presence of certain other types of hemoglobin in our body. Foremost, carboxyhemoglobin, carbon monoxide poisoning. See, what happens in carbon monoxide poisoning? Of course, this is tissue hypoxia, but still the SpO2 comes normal or the same. Why? Because carbon monoxide hemoglobin and oxyhemoglobin have the same absorbance pattern. Thus, the pulse oximeter is not able to differentiate whether it is oxyhemoglobin or carboxyhemoglobin, and the saturation comes to be normal in spite of the fact that we have histopathic tissue hypoxia happening. Second poisoning we can talk about is methemoglobinemia. What happened in methemoglobin is that methemoglobin is going to absorb both infrared as well as the red light equally. what happens is that SpO2 get fixed to 85%. Thus, if the saturation is like 95, still you will have a saturation of 85. If the saturation is 65%, still you will have a saturation of 85%, which means it is highly unreliable. Then sulf hemoglobin, low, thalassemia, low. In fetal hemoglobin, please note there will be no major effect in our saturation. If we have the presence of fetal hemoglobin, the saturation is not going to get affected much. So the two important things to remember, carboxyhemoglobin will have the same SpO2. Methemoglobin, spuriously, it will be constant at 85%. Thus, if we have higher, so it will show low. If we have low, it will show us high saturations. To overcome this, we have something which is known as co-oximeters. Like pulse oximeters, we have co-oximeters. Like pulse oximeter gave us functional saturations. The pulse oximeter is going to give us the fractional saturation. Fractional saturation is the oxygen bound hemoglobin over all the other types of hemoglobin that are present. When we're talking about the functional, the denominator only had deoxygenated hemoglobin and oxygenated hemoglobin. When we talk about fractional saturation, we'll have all the other types of hemoglobin that are present. Lastly, hyperemias. Hyperemias means that you have a lot of venous blood also. When the venous blood is also very high, then even the venous blood is pulsatile in nature, because of which artifactually you have low SpO2 because of more congestion of the venous blood. Then ambient light. Optical interference is also there. If we have lights, it can interfere with the light emitting diodes, because of which what is done is, actually what happens in pulse oximetry, that per minute a lot of infrared and red lights are emitted, but for a brief second, a fraction of seconds, these LEDs get off also. And that point where the LEDs get off, it is used to detect all the ambient or the extraneous lights which are present, and it detects it and eventually it subtracts them, and we have a pulse oximeter that is free from any optical interference. Then nail polish. Yeah, this question still comes a lot. Nail polish, blue, black, brown, green. 3 B's and green. Blue, black, brown, green are going to interfere and give us a low SpO2, whereas red and purple nail paints will have no effect on the SpO2. I repeat, blue, black, brown, green, they are going to affect the SpO2. Red and purple are not going to affect. Then other factors which can affect presence of electrocautery, your neurostimulators, and yes, by common sense, anything that can decrease the perfusion, hypotension, shock, hypothermias, if there's vasoconstriction or vasopresses are going on, which can lead to vasoconstriction, and even your BP cuff. You must have seen in the OTs, or whenever you visit OT, just apply the pulse oximeter on the same arm as your BP cuff. When it is taking BP, your pulse oximeter is not going to read because there will be no perfusion till the peripheries. Then lastly, we have AV fistulas which can affect. Then heart rates. I already told dysrhythmias can affect your SpO2s. Methylene blue poisoning has again a fixed SpO2 of 65%, like carbon monoxide, which shows high, and methemoglobin, which shows fixed of 85%. And the three things which have no effect on SpO2 is the skin pigmentation, anemia, and bilirubin. All the three have no effect on the SpO2. And one more thing I had told before was fetal hemoglobin. So this was all about your pulse oximetry and systemic oxygenation part, which forms a very, very important part of your MCQs. The rest of the monitoring will be coming up in the next very sessions. So enjoy your studies. Enjoy. All the best. Thank you.